Imagine ruling an empire so vast that it stretched from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to India. An empire larger than Rome at its peak, larger than Alexander's conquests, larger than any realm before or since. This was the legacy of one man, Genghis Khan. But tonight, as the fire burns softly beside us, we'll discover how a starving orphan became the master of the world, and how his descendants would rule over more land than any family in history. Before we begin this incredible journey from the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the palaces of conquered empires, I'd love to connect with you, our listeners from around the world. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from tonight, which country, which state or province, maybe even what time it is where you are. Are you listening from a cozy bedroom in California, a late night study session in London, or perhaps starting your day with history in Sydney? I'm always fascinated to see our global community come together over these stories. And while you're down there, share your thoughts on tonight's topic. What do you know about Genghis Khan? What interests you most about his story? Your comments always inspire future episodes. If you're new here, welcome to our historical sleep stories. If you're enjoying these long-form deep dives into history's most fascinating figures, consider subscribing and giving this video a like. It really helps us reach more history lovers who might enjoy these midnight journeys through time. Now, settle in comfortably, perhaps adjust your pillow, and let the gentle crackle of our fire transport you to the harsh steppes of 12th century Mongolia, where a boy named Temüjin was about to begin a journey that would reshape the entire world. The year was approximately 1162, though exact dates are lost to the mists of time and the oral traditions of nomadic peoples, who measured years by seasons and migrations rather than written calendars. On the vast steppes of Mongolia, where the wind cuts like a blade and survival depends on strength, cunning, and the favor of the eternal blue sky, a child was born who would one day rule a quarter of the earth. His name was Temüjin, and according to Mongol legend, he entered the world clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist, an omen that the shamans interpreted as a sign that he would become a great warrior. His father, Yesugei, was a minor chief of the Borjigin clan, a man of some standing among the scattered tribes that roamed the grasslands between the Gobi Desert and the Siberian forests. The world into which Temüjin was born was one of perpetual warfare, where tribes raided each other for horses, women, and pasture rights, where survival meant constant vigilance, and where a man's worth was measured by his ability to fight, hunt, and lead. The Mongol steppes were not a place for the weak or the gentle. They were a crucible that forged hard men and harder women. People who could endure bitter winters that froze rivers solid and scorching summers that baked the earth into dust. Yesugei named his son after a Tatar chieftain he had recently captured in battle, a common practice among the Mongols who believed that taking an enemy's name would transfer their strength to the child. The Tatars were among the most feared enemies of Yesugei's people, raiders who swept down from the north to steal horses and slaves, and the choice of name reflected both respect for a worthy opponent and hope that the child would grow to surpass his namesake in strength and cunning. Temüjin's mother, Hoelun, was herself a prize of war, stolen from another tribe in a raid that had brought her to Yesugei's tent as his second wife. She was a woman of fierce intelligence and iron will, qualities that would prove crucial in the dark years that lay ahead. In the harsh world of the steppes, women were not merely decorative companions, but partners in survival, responsible for managing the complex logistics of nomadic life while their men rode to war. The Mongol family lived in a ger, a felt tent that could be dismantled and moved as the seasons required, following the grass that fed their herds of horses, sheep, and goats. Their wealth was measured not in gold or silver, but in animals. The more livestock a man owned, the more wives he could support, the more followers he could attract, and the more powerful he became. Horses were especially prized, not just for transportation, but as symbols of prestige and military might. A Mongol warrior without a horse was no warrior at all. From his earliest years, Temüjin was raised according to the harsh customs of steppe life. Mongol children learnt to ride before they could walk properly, to shoot arrows with deadly accuracy before they could read. Indeed, most Mongols never learnt to read at all, preserving their history and laws through oral tradition and the memories of designated storytellers. By the age of 4, Temüjin could sit a horse confidently. By 6, he was learning to hunt small game with bow and arrow, developing the skills that would one day make Mongol horsemen the terror of the world. The steppes taught brutal lessons to those who would master them, that strength was the only law, that mercy was often foolishness, that survival belonged to those who could adapt fastest to changing circumstances. Yesüge was determined to secure his son's future through traditional means, alliance and marriage. When Temüjin was 9 years old, his father arranged for him to be betrothed to Berta, the daughter of a chief from the Ongirat tribe. This was standard practice among the Mongols, who used marriage to cement political alliances and ensure the loyalty of allied clans. The journey to negotiate this marriage would change Temüjin's life forever, though not in the way his father intended. Yesüge and his young son travelled for several days across the steppes to reach the Ongirat encampment, where they were received with the elaborate courtesy that steppe culture demanded for such important negotiations. Berta was a girl of Temüjin's age, intelligent and strong-willed like most Mongol women, and the two children took to each other immediately. The match was considered highly advantageous by both families. The Ongirat were known for producing beautiful and capable women, while Yesüge's clan had a reputation for fierce warriors. The betrothal was celebrated with feasting and gift-giving, and it was agreed that Temüjin would remain with Berta's family for a year to cement the alliance. But as Yesüge began his journey home, confident that his son's future was secured, disaster struck in the form of an invitation that could not be refused. A group of Tatar warriors, recognizing Yesüge as an old enemy, invited him to share their meal, a request that steppe hospitality made impossible to decline, even from enemies. The Tatars poisoned Yesüge's food. By the time the Mongol chief realized what had happened, the poison was already working its way through his system. He managed to ride for home, growing weaker with each mile, but he knew that death was overtaking him. With his last strength, he sent messengers to bring Temüjin back from the Ongirat camp, knowing that his son would need to be present to claim leadership of their clan. When Temüjin arrived, his father was already dying. Yesüge's final words to his 9-year-old son were both a blessing and a burden. "You will be a great leader someday, but first you must survive. Trust no one completely, be harder than your enemies, and remember that the eternal blue sky watches over those who are strong enough to seize their destiny." With those words, Yesüge died, and Temüjin's childhood ended forever. The death of Yesüge plunged Temüjin's family into a crisis that nearly destroyed them completely. In the brutal hierarchy of steppe society, leadership was not automatically inherited. It had to be claimed and held through strength, charisma, and the ability to provide for one's followers. At 9 years old, Temüjin possessed none of these qualities in the eyes of his father's followers. The senior members of Yesüge's clan held a swift council after the funeral rites were completed. Their decision was as practical as it was heartless. They would not follow a child, and they could not afford to support his family through what promised to be a difficult period. The clan would abandon Holun and her children, taking their herds and moving to better pastures under new leadership. "The boy may have his father's blood," declared Tagutai, one of Yesüge's former supporters, who now assumed leadership of the clan. "But blood alone does not fill bellies or protect against enemies. We need a leader who can fight today, not a child who might become strong tomorrow." This abandonment was not unusual by steppe standards, where survival often required making harsh choices about who could be supported and who had to be left behind. But for Holun, who had been raised in comfort as the wife of a powerful chief, The reality was devastating. Overnight, she went from being a woman of status and security to a single mother, struggling to keep her children alive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Holun's response to this crisis revealed the iron strength that had caught Yasuge's attention years earlier. Rather than despair or beg for mercy from her husband's former followers, she gathered her children around her and made a vow that would echo through history. We are not defeated. We are Mongols, descendants of the wolf and the deer, children of the eternal blue sky. We will survive, and someday those who abandoned us will regret their choice. The family that remained consisted of Hoelun, Temüjin, his younger brothers Kasa, Kachiun, and Temüge, his half-brothers Belgute and Bekte, sons of Yasuge's first wife, and his infant sister Temüjin. They had been left with almost nothing: a few horses, some sheep, basic tools, and the clothes on their backs. For a family accustomed to the relative comfort of tribal leadership, it was a fall into destitution. Survival required learning new skills and adapting to circumstances none of them had imagined. Holun, who had never had to gather her own food, became an expert at finding edible roots, berries, and plants on the steppes. The boys learned to catch fish in the streams, hunt small game with improvised weapons, and steal what they could from other tribes when desperation demanded it. Temüjin showed an early talent for leadership even in these desperate circumstances. He organized his brothers into hunting parties, planned raids on the herds of former allies who had abandoned them, and gradually began to establish himself as the natural leader of their small group. His intelligence and determination impressed even his older half-brothers, who had initially questioned whether a 9-year-old could lead anyone. But the family's precarious existence was constantly threatened by their former enemies, who saw them as easy targets now that they lacked tribal protection. The Taichiud clan, in particular, viewed Temüjin as a potential threat who should be eliminated before he could grow strong enough to seek revenge for his father's death. The threat became reality when Temüjin was about 13 years old. A Taichiud raiding party attacked the family's camp, capturing the young man and dragging him away to face judgment from their chief. The Taichiud had decided that Yasuge's son was becoming too dangerous to leave alive, and they planned to execute him in a way that would serve as a warning to other potential enemies. Temüjin was held prisoner for several months, his neck locked in a wooden cangue that made escape nearly impossible. He was displayed publicly as a trophy, proof that the Taichiud were strong enough to capture and humiliate the son of their former enemy. But even in captivity, Temüjin was learning valuable lessons about leadership, loyalty, and the psychology of power. His escape came during a festival when his guards had been drinking heavily. Using the confusion of the celebration and the momentary carelessness of his captors, Temüjin managed to slip away from the camp and hide in a nearby stream, breathing through a reed while search parties combed the area around him. A young Taichiud warrior named Chilon found Temüjin hiding in the water but chose not to raise the alarm. Instead, he helped the fugitive escape, providing him with a horse and directions to safety. This act of unexpected mercy from an enemy would profoundly influence Temüjin's later approach to leadership. He would remember that loyalty could be earned even from former enemies, and that showing mercy to the right people at the right time could create bonds stronger than fear. When Temüjin finally made it back to his family, he found them barely surviving but still defiant. His escape had become the stuff of legend among the local tribes, and gradually, other outcasts and misfits began to gravitate toward the young man who had proven he could survive anything the steppes could throw at him. The story of Temüjin's youth reaches its darkest chapter in the conflict with his half-brother Bekte, a confrontation that would reveal both the ruthless pragmatism that would later characterize Genghis Khan and the brutal necessities of survival in a world where weakness meant death. Bekte was the eldest son of Yasuge's first wife, making him technically senior to Temüjin in the family hierarchy. As the brothers grew older and their circumstances remained desperate, tensions began to develop over leadership of their small group and access to the limited resources that kept them alive. The conflict came to a head over something as simple as a fish and a bird. During a hunting expedition, Temüjin and his full brother Kasar had managed to catch a large fish and shoot down a lark, precious sources of protein for their always hungry family. But when they returned to camp, they found that Bekter had claimed both prizes as his due, arguing that as the eldest, he had the right to the best food. For most families, this might have been a minor sibling squabble to be resolved by parental intervention. But in the desperate circumstances of the Outcast family, where every morsel of food could mean the difference between life and death, such conflicts took on much greater significance. More importantly, Bekter's assertion of authority challenged Temüjin's emerging leadership and threatened to split their small group at a time when unity was essential for survival. Holun tried to mediate between her sons, reminding them that their real enemies were external and that they could not afford to fight among themselves. But Temüjin had reached a conclusion that would shape his entire approach to leadership. In a world where only the strongest survived, there could be only one leader, and challenges to that leadership had to be met decisively. If we allow Bekter to take what belongs to all of us, Temüjin told Kasar, he will continue to take more until we are his servants rather than his brothers. Better to settle this now while we still can. The next morning, Temüjin and Kasar followed Bekter out to the grasslands, where he was watching the family's few remaining horses. The confrontation was brief and brutal. 2 arrows, shot simultaneously by the brothers, ended Bekter's life instantly. The half-brother who had challenged Temüjin's authority became the first victim of what would later become a pattern of elimination of rivals. When they returned to camp with news of what they had done, Holun's reaction was one of horror and rage. "How could you kill your own brother?" she demanded. "What kind of men murder their family over scraps of food? You have become monsters, and I am ashamed to call you my sons." But Temüjin's response revealed the cold calculation that was already beginning to replace the emotional responses of childhood. Bekter chose to challenge my authority when we could not afford division. I did not kill him from anger or hatred, but from necessity. If we are to survive in this world, we must be united under one leader. I am that leader. The killing of Bekter was a turning point in Temüjin's development, marking his transition from a desperate survivor to a calculating strategist who understood that leadership sometimes required making terrible choices. It also established a pattern that would characterize his entire career. The elimination of rivals was not a personal failing, but a political necessity, and sentiment could not be allowed to interfere with the requirements of power. The remaining family members gradually accepted Temüjin's leadership, partly from fear of his demonstrated ruthlessness, and partly from recognition that his strategic thinking offered their best hope for survival. Even Holun, despite her horror at the fratricide, began to acknowledge that her son's harsh pragmatism might be exactly what was needed to navigate their dangerous world. As word of the killing spread among the scattered tribes of the region, Temüjin's reputation began to change. He was no longer seen as merely the outcast son of a dead chief, but as a young man who would kill his own brother to maintain his authority. This reputation was both an asset and a liability. It discouraged challenges, but also marked him as potentially dangerous to anyone who might consider allying with him. The incident also taught Temüjin important lessons about the psychology of leadership that he would apply throughout his later conquests. He learned that decisive action, even when it seemed brutal, often earned more respect than merciful indecision. He discovered that reputation could be as important as actual strength in deterring enemies and attracting followers. Most importantly, he began to understand that effective leadership required the willingness to make choices that others could not or would not make. As Temüjin entered his late teens, His reputation as a survivor and potential leader began to attract the attention of other young men who found themselves similarly displaced by the harsh realities of steppe politics. The first and most important of these early followers was Jamuka, a young man from the Jadaran clan, who would become both Temüjin's closest friend and his most dangerous enemy. Jamuka was everything that Temüjin was not. Charming where Temüjin was serious, eloquent where Temüjin was direct, diplomatic where Temüjin was ruthless. The two young men were drawn to each other despite their differences, recognizing in each other qualities that complemented their own abilities. They swore the traditional Andar oath of brotherhood, becoming sworn companions who promised to support each other through all the trials that life might bring. The relationship between Temüjin and Jamuka was complex and would ultimately prove tragic. But in these early years, it provided both young men with crucial support as they began to build their own followings among the scattered outcasts and ambitious young warriors of the steppes. They hunted together, raided together, and planned together, sharing their dreams of rising above their current circumstances to become great leaders in their own right. Other early followers included Bo'orku, the son of a wealthy herder who abandoned his comfortable life to follow Temüjin after the future Khan helped him recover stolen horses. Bo'orku's decision to join Temüjin was particularly significant because it demonstrated that the young leader could attract followers from established families, not just desperate outcasts. Jelme was another crucial early supporter, a skilled blacksmith who provided Temüjin's growing band with weapons and armor in exchange for protection and a share of raiding spoils. In the metal-poor economy of the steppes, where iron weapons could mean the difference between victory and defeat, Jelme's skills made him invaluable to any aspiring leader. Subutai, who would later become one of history's greatest military tacticians, joined Temüjin's group as a young boy whose intelligence and strategic thinking quickly caught the leader's attention. Even at an early age, Subutai demonstrated the ability to think several moves ahead in the complex chess game of steppe warfare, and Temüjin began grooming him for important responsibilities within their organization. These early followers were drawn to Temüjin for various reasons. Some were attracted by his reputation for decisive leadership and tactical brilliance. Others were impressed by his demonstrated loyalty to those who served him faithfully. Unlike many steppe leaders who treated their followers as expendable resources, Temüjin invested in the development and welfare of his supporters. But perhaps most importantly, Temüjin offered his followers something that few other leaders could provide: a vision of the future that extended beyond mere survival or petty tribal conflicts. Even in these early years, before he had conquered so much as a single enemy tribe, Temüjin spoke of uniting all the Mongol clans under one banner, of ending the constant warfare that kept the steppes weak and divided. "We spend our lives fighting each other over scraps," he would tell his growing circle of supporters around their campfires, while great empires to the south and west grow rich from trade and agriculture. What could we accomplish if we stopped wasting our strength on internal conflicts and turned our attention to real conquests? This vision was radical by the standards of traditional steppe culture, which valued individual heroism and tribal independence above all else. Most Mongol leaders were content to raid their neighbors and accumulate horses and wives, measuring success by personal glory rather than collective achievement. Temüjin's emphasis on unity and long-term strategic thinking set him apart from his contemporaries and attracted followers who were capable of thinking beyond immediate gratification. The growing size and success of Temüjin's band inevitably attracted the attention of established tribal leaders, some of whom saw opportunity in allying with the rising young warrior, while others viewed him as a potential threat to their own authority. These established leaders began to take sides in what was increasingly seen as a coming struggle for dominance over the Mongol steppes. Togrul, Khan of the Karaits, and one of the most powerful leaders on the steppes, chose to ally himself with Temüjin, partly from respect for the young man's father, and partly from calculation that supporting Temüjin would give him a useful tool against his own enemies. This alliance provided Temüjin with his first taste of operating within the complex web of steppe politics, where alliances shifted constantly and today's friend could become tomorrow's enemy. But even as Temüjin was building his power base and learning the arts of leadership and diplomacy, the seeds of future conflict were already being sown. His success was generating jealousy among other young leaders who resented his rapid rise to prominence. His methods, which emphasized meritocracy and loyalty over traditional tribal hierarchies, threatened the established order that had governed steppe society for generations. Most ominously, his relationship with Jamuka was beginning to show strain as the two young men's ambitions brought them into conflict. Both believed they were destined for greatness. Both commanded growing followings of devoted warriors, and both understood that the steppes might not be large enough for two leaders of their caliber. The stage was being set for conflicts that would reshape not just the Mongol steppes, but the entire course of world history. The outcast boy, who had learned to survive through cunning and ruthlessness, was becoming a leader capable of inspiring absolute devotion and commanding vast armies. Soon, the world would learn what happened when such a man decided that survival was no longer enough, that the time had come for conquest. The restoration of Temüjin's relationship with his childhood betrothed, Berta, marked a crucial turning point in his rise to power, transforming him from a leader of outcasts and followers into a man with legitimate claims to status within the traditional tribal hierarchy. But this personal triumph would also trigger a crisis that would test every alliance he had built and force him to confront the reality that power always came with a price. When Temüjin reached his 18th year, he decided that the time had come to claim the bride who had been promised to him nearly a decade earlier. Berta's family, the Ongirat, had maintained their betrothal agreement despite Temüjin's fall from grace after his father's death, a gesture that reflected both their honor and their belief that the young man might yet fulfill his early promise. The wedding celebration was modest by the standards of great tribal leaders, but represented a significant achievement for someone who had spent most of his adolescence as an outcast. Berta brought with her a dowry that included a beautiful black sable coat, a garment of such quality that it could serve as a diplomatic gift to cement important alliances. Temüjin's decision to present this coat to Togrul, the powerful Genghis Khan, who had offered him protection and alliance, demonstrated his growing sophistication as a political leader. The gift was both a gesture of respect and a strategic investment, strengthening a relationship that provided Temüjin with access to the wider world of steppe politics. Berta herself proved to be far more than a political asset. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and possessed of the same fierce determination that had attracted Temüjin to her years earlier. Unlike many steppe wives who remained in the background of their husbands' careers, Berta became an active participant in Temüjin's rise to power, offering advice on strategy and diplomacy while managing the complex logistics of their growing household and following. But their happiness was short-lived. In a dawn raid that demonstrated both the continuing dangers of steppe life and the price of rising prominence, Merkid warriors attacked Temüjin's camp while most of his followers were away on a hunting expedition. The attack was swift and devastating. Berta was captured and carried away as a prize of war, while Temüjin barely escaped with his life. The kidnapping of Berta was more than a personal tragedy. It was a public humiliation that threatened to destroy Temüjin's reputation and dissolve the alliance network he had worked so hard to build. In the honor-based culture of the steppes, a leader who could not protect his own wife was seen as weak and unworthy of following. If Temüjin could not recover Berta quickly and decisively, his entire enterprise might collapse. His response revealed the strategic brilliance that would later make him master of the world. Rather than attempting a desperate rescue mission with his limited forces, Temüjin chose to call upon all his allies simultaneously, turning Berta's kidnapping into a test of loyalty that would either strengthen his position dramatically or destroy it completely. The alliance that assembled to rescue Berta represented an unprecedented gathering of steppe military power. Togrul contributed 20,000 Karaite warriors, while Jamukha brought his own substantial force from the Jadaran. Combined with Temüjin's personal followers, the rescue army represented one of the largest coordinated military efforts in Mongol history up to that point. The campaign against the Merkids was swift and brutal. The combined forces of the alliance struck the Merkid camps in a series of coordinated attacks that demonstrated both superior tactical planning and overwhelming numerical advantage. The Merkids, caught completely off guard by the scale and coordination of the response, were routed in battles that left hundreds dead and scattered their tribal structure beyond repair. Berta was recovered unharmed, though she was pregnant with a child whose paternity would remain uncertain, a complication that would follow the family for years to come. But the successful rescue operation had achieved far more than the recovery of one woman, however important she might be personally to Temüjin. The campaign had demonstrated Temüjin's ability to coordinate large-scale military operations involving multiple tribes and commanders. It had shown that he could inspire loyalty strong enough to motivate his allies to risk their own forces for his personal concerns. Most importantly, it had established him as a leader capable of achieving decisive victories against significant enemies. The aftermath of the Merkid campaign marked Temüjin's full emergence as a major player in steppe politics. His successful coordination of the rescue operation had impressed even his most powerful allies, while his generous sharing of captured spoils with all participants demonstrated the kind of leadership style that could hold together the fragile alliances that governed steppe society. But success also brought new challenges and complications. The very alliances that had made the rescue possible now created expectations and obligations that would be difficult to fulfill. Togrul expected continued deference and tribute in exchange for his support, while Jamukha began to view Temüjin less as a junior partner and more as a potential rival for leadership of their generation of steppe warriors. The relationship between Temüjin and Jamukha became increasingly strained as both men's ambitions grew, and their followers began to pressure them to assert dominance over each other. The traditional Anda brotherhood that had bound them together was proving inadequate to contain their competing visions of leadership and their followers' demands for definitive hierarchy. The breaking point came over a seemingly minor issue, the order of march during a joint hunting expedition. But in the status-conscious world of steppe society, such details carried enormous symbolic weight. When Jamukha insisted on taking precedence as the senior partner in their alliance, Temüjin's refusal to accept subordinate status triggered the crisis that both men had been approaching for months. The dissolution of their partnership was conducted with the formal courtesy that steppe culture demanded, but both leaders understood that they were now enemies, whose conflict would be settled only by the death or complete defeat of one or the other. The steppes were about to witness a struggle between two of the most gifted leaders of their generation, a conflict that would determine not just their personal fates, but the future direction of Mongol civilization. The split between Temüjin and Jamukha in 1180 marked the beginning of a 20-year struggle that would consume the Mongol steppes and ultimately determine the fate of much of the known world. What began as a personal rivalry between former friends evolved into a civilizational conflict between two radically different visions of how steppe society should be organized and led. Jamukha represented the traditional aristocratic approach to steppe leadership. He was the grandson of Khans, raised from birth to expect deference from his social inferiors, and committed to maintaining the ancient hierarchies that had governed Mongol society for generations. His followers were drawn primarily from established noble families who saw him as the defender of their inherited privileges and traditional ways of life. Temüjin, by contrast, had been forced to build his power base from scratch, attracting followers through demonstrated competence rather than inherited status. His approach to leadership emphasized meritocracy over aristocracy, loyalty over birth, and practical effectiveness over traditional ceremony. The men who gathered around him included many who had been marginalized by the traditional system. Younger sons, outcasts, and ambitious individuals whose talents had been overlooked by the established tribal hierarchies. The philosophical differences between the two leaders extended beyond questions of governance to encompass fundamentally different views of what the Mongol people could become. Jamuka was essentially conservative, seeking to preserve the traditional steppe way of life while increasing his own power within existing structures. Temüjin was revolutionary, envisioning a transformation of Mongol society that would unite the scattered tribes into a single nation capable of challenging the great powers of the settled world. The first major confrontation between the rivals came at the Battle of Dalambalshut in 1180, where Jamuka's superior numbers and traditional cavalry tactics initially gave him a significant advantage. Temüjin's forces were defeated and scattered, and he was forced to flee into the wilderness with only a handful of loyal followers, including his brothers and his most devoted supporters like Bo-Orchu and Jelmer. For most leaders, such a devastating defeat would have marked the end of their ambitions. But Temüjin's response to the disaster revealed the psychological resilience that would later enable him to recover from setbacks that would have destroyed lesser men. Rather than accepting defeat or seeking terms with Jamuka, he used his time in exile to analyze what had gone wrong and develop new strategies for future conflicts. The years in the wilderness were harsh but educational. Temüjin's reduced following was forced to survive through hunting, gathering, and occasional raiding, experiences that kept them connected to the fundamental realities of steppe life, while their rivals enjoyed the comfort of established camps and secure food supplies. This period of hardship strengthened the bonds between Temüjin and his core supporters while providing them with intimate knowledge of terrain and survival techniques that would prove invaluable in future campaigns. More importantly, the exile years allowed Temüjin to refine his understanding of military organization and tactics. Traditional steppe warfare relied heavily on the individual heroism of warriors who fought primarily for personal glory and immediate spoils. Temüjin began to develop a more systematic approach that emphasized discipline, coordination, and strategic planning over spontaneous bravery. He organized his followers into units based on the decimal system, groups of 10, 100, and 1,000 that could be combined and recombined as tactical situations demanded. This organizational innovation would later become one of the hallmarks of Mongol military efficiency, but its origins lay in the practical necessities of managing a small group of exiles who needed to maximize their effectiveness against larger enemy forces. Leadership positions within these units were assigned based on demonstrated competence rather than social rank, a practice that scandalized traditional observers but proved remarkably effective at identifying and developing talent. Men who might have remained minor figures under the aristocratic system found themselves elevated to positions of real responsibility based on their abilities as warriors, scouts, or administrators. The loyalty that this meritocratic approach generated among Temüjin's followers was qualitatively different from the traditional bonds that held steppe armies together. Instead of fighting for individual glory or family honor, Temüjin's men fought for a leader who had proven his commitment to their welfare and advancement. This created a cohesion and discipline that would eventually prove superior to the more individualistic approach favored by their enemies. As the 1180s progressed, Temüjin began to attract new followers who were drawn by reports of his innovative leadership style and his growing reputation for treating his supporters fairly. Young warriors from various tribes began to desert established leaders to join the exile army, bringing with them fresh horses, weapons, and intelligence which about enemy movements and intentions. The transformation of Temüjin's force from a band of desperate exiles into a disciplined military organization did not go unnoticed by the established powers of the steppes. Togrul, the Khairite Khan who had previously supported Temüjin, began to worry about the implications of his protégé's growing independence and military sophistication. Jamuka, meanwhile, found himself facing not just a defeated rival, but a new kind of enemy, whose methods and objectives he struggled to understand. By 1190, Temüjin felt strong enough to emerge from exile and begin actively challenging the dominance of his enemies. His first targets were the smaller tribes that had allied themselves with Jamuka, groups that could be defeated individually before they could combine their forces effectively. Each victory brought new horses, weapons, and followers, gradually building the momentum that would eventually carry Temüjin to supreme power. The psychological impact of these early victories was as important as their material benefits. Word spread across the steppes that the Outcast leader had not only survived his defeat, but had somehow become more dangerous than before. The mystique of invincibility that would later surround Genghis Khan was beginning to form, as stories circulated about a leader who could not be permanently defeated, and who seemed to grow stronger with each setback. The transformation of Temüjin from tribal outcast to supreme Khan required more than military victory. It demanded the kind of spiritual and political legitimacy that could unite the fractious Mongol tribes under a single banner. That legitimacy came in 1206 at a great assembly known as a Kurultai, where Temüjin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler of all the Mongol peoples. The path to this moment had been paved with 20 years of warfare, diplomacy, and strategic alliance building that had gradually brought more and more of the steppe tribes under Temüjin's direct control or influence. The final victory over Jamuka in 1204 had eliminated his last serious rival for supremacy, while careful negotiations had convinced even former enemies that their interests would be better served by submission than continued resistance. But the Kurultai of 1206 was more than a political convention. It was a sacred ceremony that transformed Temüjin from merely the most powerful leader on the steppes into something approaching a divine figure. The assembly was attended by shamans, tribal elders, and military commanders from across the Mongol territories, all gathered to witness and participate in the creation of a new form of authority that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. The election itself followed ancient Mongol custom, with the assembled leaders formally offering their submission to Temüjin and acknowledging his authority over their own tribes and followers. But the title they bestowed upon him, Genghis Khan, was unprecedented in its scope and implications. The exact meaning of Genghis remains debated by scholars, but it clearly conveyed the concept of universal or oceanic power, suggesting dominion that extended as far as the horizon itself. The ceremony included elaborate rituals designed to demonstrate that Temüjin's elevation had the approval of Tengri, the eternal blue sky that governed the spiritual world of the steppes. Shamans performed divinations that revealed favorable omens, while tribal storytellers recited genealogies that connected the new Khan to legendary heroes and divine ancestors. The message was clear. This was not merely a political arrangement, but a cosmic event that restored the proper order of the universe. The practical implications of Temüjin's elevation to Supreme Khan were immediately apparent in the sweeping reforms he implemented to consolidate his authority and prepare for the conquest that would follow. The traditional tribal structure that had governed Mongol society for generations was systematically dismantled and replaced with a new organization based on military efficiency and personal loyalty to the Khan. The decimal military system that Temüjin had developed during his exile years was now applied to the entire Mongol nation. Every male citizen was assigned to a unit of 10, 100, 1,000, or 10,000 tumen, with leadership positions filled based on demonstrated competence rather than hereditary privilege. This system not only provided an effective military organization, but also created new social bonds that cut across traditional tribal loyalties. Perhaps most revolutionary was Genghis Khan's approach to social mobility and meritocracy. Under the traditional system, A person's position in society was largely determined by the circumstances of their birth. Under the new order, talent and loyalty could elevate even the humblest follower to positions of real authority. Former enemies, who submitted genuinely, could find themselves serving as trusted generals, while longtime supporters who proved incompetent could find themselves relegated to minor roles. The legal code that Genghis Khan established, known as the Yasa, reflected his practical approach to governance and his understanding that unity required clear, consistently enforced rules that applied to everyone, regardless of their background. The Yasa covered everything from military discipline to religious tolerance, from commercial law to diplomatic protocol, creating a comprehensive framework for governing the diverse populations that would soon come under Mongol rule. Religious tolerance was a particularly important innovation, as it allowed the Mongols to incorporate conquered peoples without forcing them to abandon their traditional beliefs and practices. This policy would prove crucial in the administration of the vast empire that was beginning to take shape, as it reduced resistance to Mongol rule while allowing local administrators to continue functioning effectively under new management. The Kurultai of 1206 also established the foundations for the diplomatic and intelligence networks that would later enable the Mongols to coordinate their far-flung military campaigns and maintain communication across vast distances. Genghis Khan understood that effective conquest required detailed knowledge of enemy strengths and weaknesses, and he began systematically gathering information about the kingdoms and empires that surrounded the Mongol homeland. Trade relations with settled peoples provided cover for this intelligence gathering. As Mongol merchants and diplomatic envoys moved freely throughout Central Asia, China, and the Islamic world, mapping territories, assessing military capabilities, and identifying potential allies or internal conflicts that could be exploited during future campaigns. But perhaps the most significant outcome of the 1206 Kurultai was the sense of destiny and mission that it instilled in the Mongol people. No longer were they simply scattered tribes fighting over grassland and horses. They were now part of a unified nation with a divine mandate to bring their form of order to the entire world. This psychological transformation would prove as important as any military innovation in enabling the incredible conquests that were about to begin. As Genghis Khan stood before the assembled leaders of his people, accepting their submission and proclaiming his intention to extend Mongol dominion to the ends of the earth, he was no longer the desperate orphan who had learned to survive through cunning and ruthlessness. He had become something new in world history, a leader who combined the mobility and military effectiveness of nomadic culture with the organizational sophistication and strategic vision necessary to build and maintain a global empire. The fire burns lower as we conclude this first chapter of Genghis Khan's incredible story. But we have only begun to explore the transformation of Temüjin from outcast child to universal ruler. In the chapters that follow, we will witness how this newly proclaimed Khan would use his unified Mongol nation as the foundation for conquest that would reshape the map of the world and bring the military innovations of the steppes to bear against the greatest powers of his age. The boy who had learned to survive by eating roots and hunting mice had become the man who would soon teach emperors and sultans the meaning of fear. The great conquests were about to begin, and the world would never be the same again. The fire crackles with renewed intensity tonight as we continue our journey through the extraordinary life of Genghis Khan. Having witnessed his transformation from outcast orphan to supreme ruler of the Mongol steppes, we now turn to the moment when this master of the grasslands set his sights on a prize that seemed impossible, the mighty Jin dynasty of northern China, protected by the Great Wall and defended by armies that had never known defeat at the hands of barbarian nomads. The year 1207 marked the beginning of Genghis Khan's transformation from regional warlord to world conqueror. No longer content with ruling the steppes, he turned his unified Mongol nation toward the glittering cities and vast wealth of the settled world. His first target would be the Jin dynasty, a choice that seemed like madness to those who understood the vast disparity in numbers, resources, and defensive advantages between the nomadic Mongols and the sophisticated Chinese Empire. But Genghis Khan had not spent 20 years learning the arts of war and leadership to be deterred by conventional wisdom. Tonight, as the flames dance in our hearth, we witness how a master strategist used speed, deception, and psychological warfare to bring down an empire that had stood for over a century, proving that even the mightiest walls could not protect against an enemy who refused to fight by the traditional rules of civilized warfare. The Jin dynasty that Genghis Khan chose to challenge in 1207 was one of the most formidable military powers in the world, controlling northern China with an iron fist and protected by defenses that had turned back nomadic invasions for generations. Founded by the Jurchen people in 1115, the Jin had conquered the previous Song dynasty's northern territories and established themselves as masters of a realm that contained over 50 million people and commanded resources beyond the imagination of steppe dwellers. The Jin Empire was protected by more than mere military might. It was shielded by the Great Wall of China, that legendary barrier of stone and earth that stretched for thousands of miles across the northern frontier. This was not the romanticized tourist attraction of later centuries, but a living military installation manned by professional soldiers and equipped with the most advanced defensive technology of the age. Watchtowers provided early warning of approaching armies, while fortified gates controlled access to the fertile lands beyond. Behind this wall lay a civilization that had reached heights of sophistication unknown to the nomadic peoples of the steppes. Chinese cities contained hundreds of thousands of inhabitants living in luxury that would have astonished Mongol warriors accustomed to felt tents and portable possessions. Markets overflowed with silk, porcelain, spices, and manufactured goods that represented the pinnacle of medieval technology and craftsmanship. The Jin military was a professional force, organized along lines that would have been familiar to any civilized army of the period. Heavy cavalry provided shock power, while disciplined infantry formations could hold defensive positions against massive numerical odds. Siege engines and firearms gave the Chinese significant advantages in both offensive and defensive operations, while a sophisticated logistical system could supply large armies operating far from their bases. Most importantly, from a strategic perspective, the Jin dynasty possessed something that the Mongols entirely lacked: a stable agricultural base capable of supporting large populations and extensive military operations. Chinese farmers could produce food surpluses that allowed for the maintenance of professional armies, while Chinese artisans could manufacture weapons, armor, and siege equipment in quantities that dwarfed anything possible on the steppes. The political structure of the Jin Empire was equally formidable, based on centuries of administrative experience and supported by a class of educated bureaucrats who understood the complexities of governing large territories and diverse populations. The emperor wielded absolute authority through a hierarchy of officials who could coordinate military campaigns, collect taxes, and maintain order across vast distances. Intelligence networks provided the Jin government with detailed information about potential threats, including regular reports on the activities of steppe tribes and their leaders. Chinese officials were well aware of Genghis Khan's recent unification of the Mongols, but they viewed this development with more curiosity than concern. After all, barbarian confederations had risen and fallen many times throughout Chinese history, and none had ever posed a serious long-term threat to the stability of settled civilization. The conventional wisdom among Chinese strategists was that nomadic armies, while dangerous in raids and border skirmishes, lacked the discipline and logistical capabilities necessary for sustained campaigns against fortified positions. Steppe warriors might win quick victories through surprise and mobility, but they could not maintain sieges or occupy territory for extended periods. Time and the defensive advantages of civilized warfare would always favor the settled peoples over the nomads. This confidence was reinforced by recent history. which seemed to validate Chinese assumptions about nomadic limitations. Previous Mongol raids had been turned back at the Great Wall or defeated by Chinese armies operating in familiar terrain. The Jin dynasty had no reason to believe that Genghis Khan's Mongols would prove any more successful than their predecessors. But the Chinese strategists who dismissed the Mongol threat were making a fundamental error. They were preparing to fight the barbarians of the past, not the revolutionary force that Genghis Khan had created through 2 decades of warfare and organizational innovation. The unified Mongol nation that emerged from the steppes in 1207 was qualitatively different from any nomadic confederation that had previously threatened Chinese civilization. Genghis Khan had studied Chinese military capabilities carefully through his network of traders and spies, and he understood both their strengths and their weaknesses far better than they understood his. While Chinese commanders prepared to defend against traditional nomadic tactics, Genghis Khan was developing entirely new approaches to warfare that would exploit the very advantages that the Chinese believed made them invulnerable. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the Jin dynasty, but the future relationship between nomadic and settled civilizations across the Eurasian continent. The empire behind the wall was about to discover that its greatest protection could become its greatest vulnerability when faced with an enemy who understood that the rules of warfare were written by victors, not by tradition. The military system that Genghis Khan unleashed against the Jin dynasty was unlike anything the world had ever seen. A perfect fusion of nomadic mobility with systematic organization that created a fighting force capable of operating effectively across vast distances while maintaining discipline and coordination that rivaled the best professional armies of settled civilizations. At the heart of Mongol military effectiveness was the horse, but not simply as a means of transportation. Every Mongol warrior maintained a string of 3 to 5 mounts, allowing him to remain mobile even on extended campaigns by rotating between fresh horses. This gave Mongol armies strategic mobility that was simply impossible for their enemies to match. They could cover distances in days that would take conventional armies weeks to traverse. But mobility alone would not have been sufficient to overcome the defensive advantages of the Jin dynasty. Genghis Khan's true innovation lay in combining traditional steppe skills with systematic military organization and strategic thinking that transformed the Mongols from raiders into conquerors, capable of sustained campaigns against the most sophisticated enemies. The decimal organization that Genghis Khan had developed during his rise to power provided the framework for military units that could operate independently while remaining a part of a coordinated whole. Units of 10, Arban, 100, Jaegun, 1,000 Minghan, and 10,000 Shuntumen could be combined and recombined as tactical situations demanded, providing commanders with unprecedented flexibility in responding to changing battlefield conditions. Command and control was maintained through a sophisticated system of signals, messengers, and predetermined tactical protocols that allowed Mongol armies to execute complex maneuvers even when separated by great distances. Smoke signals, flag movements, and mounted messengers could coordinate the movements of multiple tumens across battlefields that might stretch for dozens of miles. The Mongol bow was perhaps the most effective individual weapon of the medieval period, capable of accurate fire at ranges that exceeded those of Chinese crossbows, while being far more rapid to reload and aim. Mongol warriors trained from childhood to shoot accurately while riding at full gallop, a skill that gave them enormous advantages in the fluid, mobile combat that characterized steppe warfare. But Genghis Khan understood that traditional nomadic tactics would be insufficient against Chinese fortifications and organized infantry. His solution was to adapt enemy techniques and technologies while retaining the mobility advantages that made Mongol cavalry so effective. Chinese siege engineers who were captured or who defected brought knowledge of advanced siege techniques, while Chinese artisans taught Mongol craftsmen to manufacture siege engines and other specialized military equipment. The psychological dimensions of Mongol warfare were as important as their tactical innovations. Genghis Khan understood that fear could be as effective as physical force in breaking enemy resistance, and he systematically cultivated a reputation for invincibility and ruthlessness that often caused enemies to surrender without fighting rather than face the prospect of total destruction. This psychological warfare was supported by an intelligence network that gathered detailed information about enemy strengths, weaknesses, and internal divisions that could be exploited during military campaigns. Mongol merchants, diplomats, and spies provided commanders with maps, assessments of fortifications, and insights into enemy morale and leadership that allowed for precise targeting of vulnerable points. The logistical system that supported Mongol armies was equally innovative, based on the principle of living off the land, while maintaining the mobility that was essential to their tactical approach. Mongol warriors carried minimal supplies, relying instead on their ability to hunt, forage, and capture enemy resources to sustain themselves during extended campaigns. This approach to logistics allowed Mongol armies to operate far from their bases for extended periods, without the vulnerable supply trains that limited the operational range of conventional forces. When combined with their superior mobility, this logistical independence made it virtually impossible for enemies to predict where Mongol attacks would come from or how long they might be sustained. Perhaps most importantly, Genghis Khan had created a military culture that emphasized adaptability, initiative, and learning from both successes and failures. Mongol commanders were encouraged to experiment with new tactics and technologies, while systematic debriefing after each campaign ensured that successful innovations were rapidly disseminated throughout the army. This culture of continuous improvement meant that the Mongol military system evolved constantly, incorporating lessons learned from each enemy they encountered and adapting to new challenges with remarkable speed. The force that attacked the Jin dynasty in 1207 was already significantly more sophisticated than the army that had unified the steppes, and it would continue to evolve throughout the long years of the Chinese campaigns. The Jin dynasty, despite its vast resources and professional military, was about to face an enemy that combined the traditional advantages of nomadic warfare with systematic organization and strategic innovation that had never before been brought to bear against Chinese civilization. The ancient assumption that barbarians could never seriously threaten the settled world was about to be tested by a military revolution that would reshape the balance of power across Eurasia. Genghis Khan's initial approach to the conquest of the Jin dynasty demonstrated the strategic patience and systematic intelligence gathering that would characterize all of his major campaigns. Rather than launching an immediate full-scale invasion, he began with a series of carefully planned probes and raids designed to test Chinese defenses, gather intelligence, and gradually escalate pressure while preparing for the massive effort that would be required to breach the Great Wall. The first Mongol incursions into Jin territory began in 1207 with attacks on border fortifications and military outposts that served multiple purposes. These raids allowed Mongol commanders to assess the effectiveness of Chinese defensive arrangements while providing their warriors with valuable experience in fighting against settled armies using unfamiliar tactics and equipment. The psychological impact of these early attacks was as important as their military results. Chinese border officials, accustomed to dealing with small-scale nomadic raids that could be easily repelled, found themselves facing coordinated assaults by disciplined forces that demonstrated unprecedented tactical sophistication and persistence. Mongol raiders would appear suddenly at multiple points along the frontier, strike with devastating effectiveness, and vanish before Chinese reinforcements could arrive to engage them. This pattern of attack created an atmosphere of constant tension and uncertainty among Chinese defenders, who could never be sure where the next assault would come from or how large it might be. More troubling from the Chinese perspective, was the evident quality of Mongol intelligence about Jin military dispositions and capabilities. Mongol attacks consistently targeted the most vulnerable points in Chinese defenses, while avoiding areas where significant resistance could be expected. This suggested a level of reconnaissance and planning that exceeded anything that Chinese strategists had previously attributed to nomadic forces. The Mongols also demonstrated disturbing adaptability in their approach to siege warfare, quickly learning to counter Chinese defensive techniques, while developing new methods for attacking fortified positions. Chinese observers noted with alarm that Mongol forces seemed to improve their siege capabilities with each engagement, suggesting a systematic approach to military innovation that was completely at odds with traditional assumptions about barbarian warfare. Perhaps most ominously, the Mongols began to demonstrate their ability to coordinate large-scale operations across vast distances with a precision that rivaled the best Chinese military planning. Multiple Mongol forces would attack different targets simultaneously, sometimes hundreds of miles apart, with timing that suggested sophisticated command and control capabilities. These coordinated attacks served to stretch Chinese defensive resources while preventing effective concentration of forces against any single Mongol thrust. Jin commanders found themselves playing a deadly game of military chess against an opponent who seemed to anticipate their moves, while concealing his own intentions until the moment of attack. The intelligence war became as important as the physical conflict, with both sides working desperately to understand their opponent's capabilities and intentions. Chinese spies attempted to infiltrate Mongol camps and assess their numbers and equipment, while Mongol agents gathered detailed information about Chinese fortifications, troop dispositions, and internal political dynamics. In this contest of intelligence and counterintelligence, the Mongols held significant advantages due to their mobility and the ethnic diversity of their forces. Mongol armies included warriors from numerous conquered tribes, some of whom could pass easily among Chinese populations without arousing suspicion. Chinese forces, by contrast, found it virtually impossible to infiltrate the close-knit tribal structure of Mongol society. The economic impact of the Mongol raids began to accumulate as Chinese trade routes were disrupted and border regions were depopulated by the constant threat of attack. Merchants avoided areas that had become dangerous, while farmers abandoned fields that were too exposed to Mongol raiding parties. The tax revenues that supported the Jin military began to decline, just as the need for increased military expenditure was becoming urgent. Chinese attempts to negotiate with the Mongols revealed another disturbing development. Genghis Khan's representatives demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Chinese politics and diplomacy, while making demands that suggested long-term strategic objectives rather than mere raiding for immediate profit. The Mongols were not simply seeking tribute or temporary advantage, they appeared to be laying the groundwork for systematic conquest. The Jin court's response to these early Mongol successes was hampered by internal political divisions and overconfidence based on previous experience with nomadic threats. Conservative officials argued that the raids would eventually exhaust themselves, as all barbarian incursions had in the past, while more aggressive voices called for massive military expeditions to crush the Mongol threat before it could develop further. The debate over strategy was complicated by the enormous costs that would be required for effective military action against the Mongols. Defending the entire length of the Great Wall against coordinated attacks would require mobilizing resources on a scale that would strain even the vast wealth of the Jin Empire, while offensive operations into the steppes would be logistically complex and militarily risky. By 1209, it had become clear to Chinese strategists that they were facing a qualitatively different threat than any previous nomadic confederation. The Mongols under Genghis Khan had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded traditional barbarian limitations, while showing no sign of the internal divisions or lack of staying power that had historically caused nomadic confederations to collapse under their own contradictions. The stage was set for an escalation that would test the fundamental assumptions about the relationship between nomadic and settled civilizations. The Jin dynasty, protected by the Great Wall and supported by the vast resources of Chinese civilization, was about to face the full fury of the most effective military machine that the nomadic world had ever produced. The Great Wall of China had stood as the ultimate symbol of Chinese defensive might for over 1,000 years, an apparently impregnable barrier that had turned back countless nomadic invasions and protected the civilized world from barbarian conquest. But in 1211, Genghis Khan's Mongol army achieved what had seemed impossible. They breached the wall and poured into northern China like a flood, beginning a campaign of conquest that would bring one of the world's great empires to its knees. The breakthrough came not through brute force assault against the wall's strongest points, but through the kind of strategic deception and tactical innovation that characterized all of Genghis Khan's major military achievements. Intelligence gathered during 3 years of probing attacks had identified several key weaknesses in the Chinese defensive system that could be exploited by an enemy willing to think beyond conventional siege warfare. The Mongol assault began with a massive feint against the heavily fortified Juyong Pass, drawing Chinese reserves and attention toward what appeared to be the main effort. Meanwhile, the real attack was developing at multiple points along less heavily defended sections of the wall, where Mongol engineers had identified structural vulnerabilities that could be exploited through coordinated assault. The key innovation that enabled the Mongols to breach the wall was their adaptation of Chinese siege techniques to nomadic warfare capabilities. Rather than attempting to build traditional siege engines that would require extended construction time and vulnerable supply lines, Mongol engineers developed portable siege equipment that could be rapidly assembled and deployed by cavalry forces. Chinese defenders found themselves facing siege techniques that they had never encountered. Mobile catapults that could be brought into position quickly and repositioned to avoid counter-battery fire. Scaling ladders that could be assembled from prefabricated components, and tunneling operations that proceeded with a speed and efficiency that exceeded anything in Chinese military experience. More troubling still was the Mongol ability to coordinate simultaneous attacks against multiple points along the wall, stretching Chinese defensive resources beyond their capacity to respond effectively. While Chinese commanders were dealing with major assaults at fortified passes, other Mongol forces were exploiting weakly defended gaps or using captured Chinese siege equipment to create new breaches. The psychological impact of the wall's breach was as devastating as its military consequences. For over a millennium, the Great Wall had represented the absolute boundary between civilization and barbarism, the ultimate guarantee that Chinese society could not be conquered by nomadic invaders. Its fall shattered fundamental assumptions about Chinese security and created panic that spread far beyond the immediate area of the breakthrough. Chinese armies that had been positioned to defend specific sections of the wall found themselves outflanked and surrounded as Mongol cavalry poured through multiple breaches. The linear defensive strategy that had been effective against traditional nomadic raids proved completely inadequate against an enemy that could create their own entry points and operate effectively behind Chinese defensive lines. The speed of the Mongol advance once the wall was breached surprised even Chinese commanders who understood the mobility advantages of nomadic cavalry. Mongol forces seemed to appear simultaneously at dozens of locations throughout northern China, striking at administrative centers, military installations, and economic targets with a coordination that suggested careful advance planning and sophisticated intelligence. Chinese attempts to organize coherent resistance were hampered by the breakdown of communication systems that had been designed around the assumption that the Great Wall would channel enemy attacks into predictable patterns. With Mongol forces operating throughout the Chinese rear areas, traditional command and control structures collapsed under the strain of trying to coordinate responses to threats that seemed to emerge from everywhere at once. The economic disruption caused by the Mongol breakthrough was immediate and severe. Trade routes that had functioned safely for generations became highways for Mongol raiding parties, while administrative centers that collected taxes and coordinated government functions found themselves under constant threat of attack. Chinese refugees fleeing the Mongol advance carried stories of unprecedented destruction and military effectiveness that further demoralized resistance efforts. The image of invincible Chinese civilization, protected by impregnable defenses, was replaced by accounts of nomadic warriors who seemed capable of conquering anything they chose to attack. The Jin court's response to the crisis revealed the internal divisions and strategic confusion that would ultimately contribute to their defeat. Conservative officials continued to believe that the Mongol success was temporary and that traditional defensive strategies would eventually prove successful, while others argued for radical changes in military organization and tactics to counter the nomadic threat. The debate over strategy was complicated by the enormous scale of the disaster and the unprecedented nature of the threat they were facing. Previous nomadic invasions had been contained through a combination of defensive fortifications and diplomatic arrangements that satisfied barbarian demands for tribute, while preserving Chinese territorial integrity. The Mongols under Genghis Khan seemed interested in conquest rather than mere tribute, requiring a completely different strategic response. As 1211 progressed, it became clear that the breach of the Great Wall was not a temporary setback, but the beginning of a systematic campaign designed to destroy Jin power and establish Mongol dominion over northern China. The empire that had seemed invulnerable behind its ancient defenses was about to learn that even the mightiest walls were useless against an enemy who refused to be constrained by the traditional rules of civilized warfare. The dragon was wounded, and Genghis Khan was just beginning to demonstrate how a master predator finishes his prey. The transformation of Genghis Khan from steppe warlord to master of siege warfare represents one of the most remarkable adaptations in military history. The man who had learned to fight on the open grasslands of Mongolia now applied his genius for organization and innovation to the complex art of capturing fortified cities, developing techniques that would prove devastatingly effective against the most sophisticated defensive systems of the medieval world. The first major test of Mongol siege capabilities came with the attack on Beijing, the capital of the Jin dynasty and one of the most heavily fortified cities in the world. Beijing's defenses had been refined over centuries of warfare, incorporating the most advanced military engineering available to Chinese civilization. Massive walls, elaborate gate systems, and sophisticated defensive weapons made the city appear virtually impregnable to conventional assault. Genghis Khan's approach to the siege demonstrated the systematic intelligence gathering and careful planning that characterized all of his major campaigns. For months before the attack began, Mongol agents had been mapping the city's defenses, identifying weak points, and gathering information about the garrison's capabilities and the civilian population's morale. The siege itself began not with a direct assault, but with a systematic campaign to isolate the city from all outside support. Mongol forces established a complete blockade that prevented the movement of supplies, reinforcements, or communication between Beijing and the rest of the Jin Empire. This isolation served both practical and psychological purposes, gradually weakening the defenders while demonstrating Mongol control over the surrounding territory. The technical innovations that the Mongols brought to siege warfare reflected their ability to learn from conquered enemies while adapting foreign techniques to their own tactical requirements. Chinese siege engineers who had been captured or who had defected provided knowledge of advanced siege techniques, while Chinese artisans taught Mongol craftsmen to manufacture siege engines and other specialized military equipment. But the Mongols did not simply copy Chinese siege techniques. They improved upon them by incorporating the mobility and flexibility that characterized all aspects of their military system. Traditional siege engines were heavy, slow to position, and vulnerable to counterattack. Mongol siege equipment was designed to be rapidly assembled, easily repositioned, and operated by cavalry forces that could withdraw quickly if threatened. The psychological dimensions of Mongol siege warfare were as important as their technical innovations. Genghis Khan understood that the terror of his reputation could often accomplish more than physical force in breaking enemy resistance. Stories of previous Mongol conquests were deliberately spread among the defenders, while visible preparations for assault created an atmosphere of impending doom that gradually eroded morale. The use of captured populations as human shields during siege operations was one of the most controversial aspects of Mongol tactical doctrine, but it proved devastatingly effective against enemies who were constrained by civilized notions of acceptable warfare. Chinese defenders found themselves unable to use their most effective weapons against Mongol siege engines that were operated by Chinese captives, creating tactical dilemmas that had no satisfactory solution. The coordination of multiple siege operations simultaneously was another Mongol innovation that exceeded anything in contemporary military practice. While maintaining the siege of Beijing, Mongol forces were simultaneously attacking dozens of other fortified positions throughout northern China, preventing effective concentration of Chinese resistance, while demonstrating the unprecedented scale of nomadic military capabilities. The logistical support for these extended siege operations required organizational capabilities that seemed impossible for nomadic forces to maintain. Traditional assumptions about nomadic limitations suggested that steppe armies could not sustain the kind of lengthy campaigns that siege warfare demanded. The Mongols proved these assumptions wrong by developing supply systems that combined traditional nomadic mobility with systematic exploitation of captured territory. Chinese attempts to relieve the siege of Beijing were frustrated by Mongol tactical innovations that turned traditional defensive advantages into vulnerabilities. Relief armies that approached the city found themselves facing mobile Mongol forces that could concentrate rapidly at any threatened point, while maintaining the siege of the capital with minimal forces. The siege engines that the Mongols employed against Beijing represented the culmination of military engineering knowledge gathered from across their expanding empire. Techniques learned from Chinese siege engineers were combined with innovations adapted from Central Asian and Islamic siege warfare, creating a sophisticated arsenal that exceeded the defensive capabilities of even the most advanced fortifications. The fall of Beijing's outer defenses in 12 and 14 marked a turning point not just in the campaign against the Jin dynasty, but in the history of siege warfare itself. The Mongols had demonstrated that nomadic armies could master the complex arts of siegecraft, while retaining the mobility advantages that made them so effective in open combat. The psychological impact of Beijing's fall extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The capital of the Jin dynasty had been considered one of the most impregnable cities in the world, protected by defenses that had never been seriously threatened by any previous enemy. Its capture by nomadic forces shattered fundamental assumptions about the military balance between settled and nomadic civilizations. Chinese commanders, who had dismissed the Mongol threat as merely another barbarian raid, were forced to confront the reality that they were facing an enemy who had mastered every aspect of civilized warfare while retaining all the advantages of nomadic mobility and organization. The strategic situation had been completely reversed. The Mongols now held the initiative throughout northern China, while Chinese forces found themselves constantly reacting to threats that seemed to emerge from every direction. The siege of Beijing had transformed Genghis Khan from a regional warlord into a conqueror capable of challenging the greatest powers of the civilized world. The techniques and innovations developed during the Chinese campaigns would soon be applied against targets across the Eurasian continent, as the Mongol war machine turned its attention to even greater prizes in the Islamic world and Europe. The fall of Beijing in 1215 sent shockwaves throughout the Jin Empire and beyond, as news of the Mongol victory spread to every corner of the civilized world. The capital that had seemed impregnable was now in the hands of nomadic conquerors, and the psychological impact of this achievement was as devastating as its immediate military consequences. the Jin dynasty found itself facing a crisis unlike anything in its history. Not only had they lost their capital and the symbolic heart of their empire, but the entire foundation of their defensive strategy had been proven inadequate against an enemy who seemed capable of conquering anything they chose to attack. The Great Wall lay breached in dozens of places. Major cities had fallen to siege, and Mongol armies were operating freely throughout the northern provinces. The emperor's response to the crisis revealed the internal divisions and strategic confusion that would ultimately contribute to the dynasty's downfall. Rather than attempting to mount an immediate counterattack to recapture Beijing, the court chose to relocate the capital to Kaifeng, hundreds of miles to the south. This decision was militarily sound. Kaifeng was better positioned for defense and farther from the immediate threat of Mongol attack. But it was also a public admission that the dynasty could no longer protect its traditional heartland. The evacuation of Beijing was accompanied by desperate attempts to save what could be preserved from the advancing Mongol forces. Government records, imperial treasures, and essential personnel were moved south under heavy guard, while anything that could not be transported was destroyed to prevent its capture by the enemy. The systematic destruction of Chinese resources demonstrated the extent to which the Jin leadership understood the gravity of their situation. But even as the court was retreating southward, Mongol forces were expanding their operations beyond the immediate vicinity of Beijing. The capture of the capital had provided Genghis Khan with enormous resources: treasure, weapons, siege equipment, and most importantly, thousands of Chinese artisans, engineers, and administrators who could be employed in further conquests. The integration of Chinese technical expertise into the Mongol military system marked a crucial evolution in nomadic warfare capabilities. Chinese siege engineers taught Mongol craftsmen to build more sophisticated siege engines, while Chinese administrators provided expertise in governing large settled populations that would prove essential as the Mongol Empire expanded. The economic disruption caused by the Mongol conquest of northern China extended far beyond the immediate war zone. Trade routes that had connected China with Central Asia and the Islamic world for centuries were now controlled by nomadic forces whose intentions remained unclear. Merchants who had previously moved freely between Chinese cities and foreign markets found their traditional business relationships destroyed by warfare and political upheaval. The psychological impact of the Mongol success was particularly severe among Chinese intellectuals and officials who had been educated to believe in the inherent superiority of Chinese civilization over barbarian culture. The conquest of Beijing by nomadic forces challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between civilized and nomadic peoples, forcing a painful re-evaluation of beliefs that had shaped Chinese thinking for generations. Reports of Mongol military capabilities and organizational sophistication filtered throughout the civilized world, carried by refugees, merchants, and diplomatic envoys who had witnessed the conquest firsthand. These accounts describe nomadic armies that combined traditional cavalry effectiveness with siege capabilities that rivaled the best professional forces of settled civilizations. The implications of Mongol success in China extended far beyond the immediate region. Other nomadic peoples throughout Central Asia and the steppes took notice of Genghis Khan's achievements, with many beginning to consider whether they should seek alliance with this new power or prepare to defend themselves against potential Mongol expansion. The Islamic world, already connected to China through extensive trade networks, began to receive detailed intelligence about Mongol capabilities and strategic objectives. Islamic scholars and military experts attempted to assess whether the nomadic confederation that had conquered northern China might pose a threat to the Abbasid Caliphate and other Islamic powers. European observers, though geographically distant from the immediate conflict, also began to take notice of reports about nomadic conquests in the Far East. The few European merchants and missionaries who maintained contact with Chinese markets brought back accounts of unprecedented military achievements that seemed to defy everything that civilized warfare experience suggested was possible. The Jin dynasty's attempts to organize effective resistance to the Mongol conquest were hampered by the scale of the disaster and the speed with which their strategic situation had deteriorated. Traditional defensive strategies that had proven effective against previous nomadic threats were completely inadequate against an enemy who had mastered every aspect of civilized warfare while retaining all the advantages of nomadic mobility. Diplomatic efforts to negotiate some accommodation with the Mongols revealed the ambitious scope of Genghis Khan's objectives. The nomadic leader was not interested in mere tribute or limited territorial concessions. He demanded complete submission and integration of Jin territory into his expanding empire. For the Chinese leadership, this represented an unacceptable threat to their cultural and political survival. As 1215 drew to a close, the Jin Empire found itself fundamentally weakened and increasingly isolated. The loss of Beijing and the surrounding northern provinces had deprived them of significant tax revenues and military resources, while the constant threat of Mongol attack made it difficult to plan coherent resistance strategies. More ominously, intelligence reports suggested that Genghis Khan was not content with his Chinese conquests, but was already planning expansion into other regions. The military machine that had proven so devastatingly effective against Chinese civilization was beginning to turn its attention toward new targets, promising that the upheaval that had shattered the Jin dynasty was only the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the entire Eurasian world. The dragon had been brought low, but the wolf was far from satisfied. The success in China had demonstrated that no civilization, however ancient or sophisticated, was safe from Mongol conquest. The world was about to learn that the fall of Beijing was not the end of Genghis Khan's ambitions, but merely the first chapter in a story of conquest that would encompass continents and reshape the course of human history. The conquest of northern China represented more than mere military victory for Genghis Khan. It was the validation of a revolutionary vision that would transform not just the Mongol Empire, but the entire concept of nomadic civilization's place in the world. As the flames of burning Chinese cities lit the night sky and Mongol banners flew over territories that had been ruled by settled peoples for over a millennium, the great Khan began to articulate a grand strategy that would guide his conquests for the remainder of his life. The wealth captured from the Jin dynasty provided Genghis Khan with resources on a scale that no nomadic leader had ever commanded. The treasury of Beijing alone contained enough gold, silver, and precious goods to finance military campaigns across multiple continents, while the artisans and administrators captured during the conquest provided expertise that could be applied to governing and exploiting conquered territories far more systematically than any previous nomadic confederation had achieved. But perhaps more important than the material rewards of conquest was the psychological transformation that success in China had produced within the Mongol leadership. The achievement of the impossible, the conquest of one of the world's great civilizations by nomadic forces, had proven that traditional limitations on nomadic power were artificial constraints that could be overcome through superior organization, strategy, and will. Genghis Khan's vision extended far beyond the traditional goals of steppe warfare, where previous nomadic leaders had been content to raid settled territories for immediate spoils. Genghis Khan envisioned the creation of a unified empire that would encompass both nomadic and settled peoples under Mongol rule. This was not mere conquest for its own sake, but the implementation of a coherent political philosophy that saw nomadic and settled civilizations as complementary rather than antagonistic forces. The administrative systems that the Mongols began to implement in conquered Chinese territories reflected this inclusive approach to empire building. Rather than simply extracting tribute and abandoning conquered lands to their own devices, Mongol administrators worked to integrate Chinese bureaucratic expertise with nomadic military organization, creating hybrid governmental structures that could function effectively across the diverse territories that comprised the expanding empire. The meritocratic principles that had governed Mongol society during their rise to power were extended to include conquered peoples, who demonstrated competence and loyalty. Chinese officials who submitted to Mongol authority could find themselves elevated to positions of real responsibility within the imperial administration, while Chinese military experts were incorporated into the Mongol command structure based on their abilities rather than their ethnic background. This policy of integration, rather than mere domination, served multiple purposes in Genghis Khan's strategic thinking. It maximized the human resources available to the Mongol Empire by utilizing the talents of all subject peoples. It reduced resistance to Mongol rule by offering conquered populations opportunities for advancement. And it provided the administrative expertise necessary to govern territories far more complex than the traditional nomadic homeland. The intelligence networks that had proven so effective during the Chinese campaigns were expanded to provide systematic reconnaissance of potential future targets throughout the known world. Mongol merchants, diplomats, and spies began gathering detailed information about the Islamic empires of Central Asia and the Middle East, the Christian kingdoms of Europe, and the other regional powers that might either oppose or support future Mongol expansion. The military innovations developed during the siege of Chinese cities were systematically analyzed and refined, with successful techniques being incorporated into standardized tactical doctrine that could be applied by Mongol commanders operating in any theater of operations. The siege equipment and techniques that had proven effective against Chinese fortifications were adapted for use against different types of defensive systems, while new innovations were developed to counter anticipated enemy responses. Perhaps most significantly, Genghis Khan began to develop the ideological framework that would justify and guide his expanding conquests. The concept of universal empire under Mongol leadership was not presented as mere aggression or barbarian rapacity, but as the implementation of divine will through the agency of chosen people who possessed the strength and wisdom necessary to bring order to a chaotic world. The Mongol concept of the eternal blue sky provided religious legitimacy for conquest that extended far beyond traditional steppe territories. According to this worldview, Tengri had granted the Mongols dominion over all peoples under heaven, making resistance to Mongol authority not merely political opposition, but spiritual rebellion against divine order. This ideological framework served crucial practical purposes in legitimizing Mongol rule over diverse populations, while providing moral justification for the harsh measures that conquest inevitably required. Local populations could be presented with a choice between submission to divinely sanctioned authority or destruction as enemies of cosmic order, a choice that made accommodation with Mongol rule seem both reasonable and morally necessary. The tribute and administrative systems that the Mongols implemented in conquered Chinese territories became models for the governance of future conquests. Rather than the crude extraction of wealth that had characterized previous nomadic raids, Mongol administrators established systematic taxation and trade policies that could generate sustained revenue while encouraging economic development under imperial authority. The success of these administrative innovations in China provided Genghis Khan with confidence that similar systems could be implemented across any conquered territory, regardless of the local culture or previous governmental structure. The Mongol Empire was beginning to develop the institutional foundation necessary to govern not just vast territories, but diverse civilizations with radically different traditions and expectations. As 1216 dawned, Genghis Khan stood at the threshold of a new phase in his career. The conquest of northern China had proven that nomadic forces could defeat even the most sophisticated settled civilizations when led by superior strategy and organization. The wealth and expertise captured during the Chinese campaigns provided the foundation for even more ambitious undertakings, while the ideological framework of universal empire provided justification for conquests that would reshape the political map of the entire known world. The intelligence reports that reached the Great Khan's court spoke of rich Islamic cities beyond the Western Mountains, Christian kingdoms in distant Europe, and other civilizations that had never felt the impact of nomadic military power. Each represented potential additions to an empire that was already larger than any previous nomadic confederation, but which Genghis Khan envisioned as merely the beginning of a transformation that would bring all humanity under unified rule. The transformation from tribal outcast to emperor of northern China had taken nearly half a century. But Genghis Khan was far from finished with his conquests. At 60 years of age, an advanced age by the standards of his time, the great Khan possessed more energy and ambition than men half his age. The success in China had whetted his appetite for even greater achievements, and the resources now at his disposal made previously impossible dreams seem achievable. The world was about to discover that the fall of the Jin dynasty was not an isolated victory, but the first movement in a symphony of conquest that would encompass continents and redefine the relationship between East and West, nomadic and settled, conqueror and conquered. The dragon had fallen, but Genghis Khan's vision extended far beyond China to embrace the entire civilized world. As our fire burns lower tonight, we have witnessed how a master strategist transformed the impossible dream of nomadic conquest over settled civilization into devastating reality. The techniques developed during the Chinese campaigns, the integration of siege warfare with cavalry mobility, the systematic use of captured expertise, the coordination of operations across vast distances would soon be applied against targets that had never imagined they might face such threats. The great Khan, who had once learned survival by eating roots and hunting mice, had become the master of an empire larger than any realm in history. But this was only the beginning of his story. In the chapters that follow, we will witness how Genghis Khan turned his attention westward toward the Islamic world and Europe, carrying with him the lessons learned in China and the absolute confidence that no force on earth could resist the will of the chosen people of the eternal blue sky. The fire dies to embers, but the flames of conquest that Genghis Khan had kindled in the ruins of Chinese cities would soon spread across the world, consuming empires and kingdoms that had stood for centuries, reshaping the map of humanity itself. The boy who had become a Khan was about to become something more, the architect of history's largest land empire, built on the foundation of Chinese gold and the blood of defeated dragons.